Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jaw and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
So, candidly, we are not very good at checking our Blue Security Podcast email. So I was going through it and we had a great email from a listener, Steve, and we're going to talk about some of his questions today on the show. So Steve wrote about third-party vendor and contractor access and what is the best way to go about it. And I think that's something that a lot of organizations can benefit from talking through and something that I think a lot of organizations struggle with. Steve asks, how should we be securely granting third-party elevated permissions access to our environment these days? We've got various third-party MSPs, software providers that provide support services for various applications we run in Microsoft Azure, on-premise, and SaaS services like Dynamics 365. There are a mix of Windows admins, Linux admins, network support engineers, DBAs, etc. that log into VMs or access Azure resources. So how should we be giving these guys remote access? From the identities standpoint, Steve asks, should we be creating accounts in our environment for them to use, like another username and password they'll likely write down in their customer credential page in their OneNote or whatever? Or should we be adding their corp account as guests into our Entra ID tenant? Some considerations that Steve already went through with his organization was his security team said to go with the former, as in create accounts in their environment, because, quote, we don't know if their corporate account has been compromised, as in the contractors on their home tenant. Steve was thinking that he would go with the latter because he doubts the third party will notify him or know to notify them when an employee leaves, and we'll have these enabled valid accounts still active in our environment until the next account review, which might be 6 to 12 months or more away. Yes, Entra ID governance access reviews is on our to-do list. We have no idea on the circumstances that the user left that business. They might be looking for revenge on their ex-employer. So a little insider risk. If creating an account in our environment, we need to pay attention to licensing for Entra ID, P2, Defender for Identity, etc. He's asking if they'll have to pay for additional licensing for those contracted users. And of course, that cost adds up. So a lot of questions here, right, Adam?
Yeah, let's unpack them.
You know, when it comes to B2B, let's talk about B2B first, because when we were talking through the pre-show, you had a lot of comments about what B2B is actually used for. And to me, that's enlightening because we did have a few shows. And so if you want to learn more about guest users and external identities, we have episode 91 and 152 that were a little ways back because we're on episode 235 today and we do it weekly. We haven't missed a week. So go back. We have one on guest users and MSPs as well as securing Entra external identities. But in essence, we're talking B2B here. And so B2B for Entra, and we're just talking Entra specifically now for identity, you can do a lot of things with guest users. You can assign them roles. When they come into your Entra tenant, they're essentially another account, another user identity that's in the Entra tenant, in your tenant as an external user. However, you can grant them roles, you can grant them access to different resources, you can make them an owner of a subscription, you can give them global admin. I mean, you can do all sorts of things, and you can even use PIM around that external identity. One of the things that is important to remember when it comes to security for that, right? So let's talk about security for that external identity. If you have conditional access policies, like for example, must have MFA or must have phish resistant MFA, that MFA or that phish resistant MFA for that external user is actually in their home tenant. Okay, so let's say I'm in Contoso and Adam's in Fabricam, and in Fabricam he's logging in and he just uses his username and password. They're not secure. They don't use MFA. But I have a conditional access policy that requires MFA. So when Adam is invited to the Contoso tenant, he's going to have to register MFA, but it's not with my tenant, it's with his own home tenant. Same thing with fish resistant. If I require fish resistant, Adam's going to have to register in his home Fabricam tenant a fish resistant MFA method. And if fish resistant MFA in this case, because it's not always turned on by default, if they haven't even turned it on as a method of authentication, that authentication to my tenant will be blocked. So you may have to work with the other side if you want some stringent authentication conditional access type policies. You may have to work with that vendor to figure out, can we turn that on or so on and so forth, because all the MFA methods are registered with their home tenant. Now let's talk about the purpose of B2B, because Adam, you had some great thoughts around what the purpose and why you should use B2B versus, things that you might not want to. And we'll get more into the other things.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go back in time a little bit, we used to refer to it, and by the way, Andy and I both work for Microsoft. We used to refer to it as B2B collaboration. There was that collaboration word tacked on the end of it. And today that's more kind of lumped into, you have this whole concept of external identities. Some of them can be customer identities, some of them are business partner identities, and they have different functions. And we have these guest user accounts we've referred to. That's all kind of in this same amalgam today. However, at its core, guest users, as Andy pointed out, you can have them do anything. You can give them any privilege, any role. They're not limited in any fashion. You can assign them licenses. You can give them access to enterprise applications. They can have access. You could give them an Exchange mailbox if you want. You can do all sorts of crazy things with them. However, the thing you have to keep in mind is any application I'm giving them access to, because of course, really the purpose of an identity is not to access the identity platform. It's to access applications. Are my applications going to be able to handle that guest user identity? Now, most Microsoft tools, yes, absolutely. They have native support for them. So you can use guest user identities with Dynamics 365, with Exchange Online, with SharePoint Online, with Teams, great experience in Teams. But it's really intended at its primary use case is I have a SharePoint site. I want to bring in a trusted business partner to share and collaborate on these 5 documents. Or I have a Teams channel and I want to bring in some folks from other organizations to chat about something. So it's usually this really focused business to business collaboration concept is the primary time you would use it. Now, again, just so I'm covering all the bases, you can use these for other things. They get a full user object. You can give them access to third-party SaaS applications. Now, are those applications going to be able to handle these user objects? Because they kind of have a weird format. They have like pound signs in them and external, and they look really weird. But like theoretically, yes, you could give a guest user access to your Salesforce.com tenant and get in that environment and do stuff in CRM. It's theoretically possible, but it does start to get kind of tricky at a certain point. So that's why I would recommend, for the most part, B2B, what we used to call B2B, what we call guest users. It's all these different terminology. They all mean the same thing. Primary use case is still that business to business collaboration kind of concept, and mostly in what we'd refer to as kind of those core Office 365 applications. SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Teams are kind of the primary places where you would use that.
And then there's the concept of licensing too. So like, let's
talk about that too.
Yeah. So let's say my tenant has Entra P2, and so I'm using risk-based conditional access, and Adam's tenant has Entra P1. So they don't have risk-based conditional access. And so we can talk about, what it means for the identity portion, but let's say then you grant them access to something and, they might authenticate through some other means. So I'm just using it in the abstract, but like if they had a desktop that with MDE, Defender for Endpoint, or they run through MDI, or they get a mailbox that uses MDO. So what does it mean for those other services? And so Adam, you had some thoughts about the different carve-outs that we grant when it comes to a licensing model.
Yeah, absolutely. And also this usually comes up when we talk about B2B. People remember there used to be this model, and you may be grandfathered in. Check with your Microsoft account team on this. I'm not sure if this is still a thing or not, where let's say your organization has 1,000 Entra ID P2 licenses. We used to do this model where we could say for guest users and genuine guest users, you can bring them in at a 5-to-1 ratio. So that is, you could bring in 5,000 guest users and give them access to all the same Entra ID P2 capabilities that your home users have, the people that are in your home tenant, your corporate identities. And you can give them access to all the same things: risk-based conditional access, access reviews, entitlement management, privileged identity management. All of those things they could use as well without an additional license. If that's not still a thing, that's fine, because the new model now is your first 50,000 external identities in any given tenant are at no additional cost. So that brings together both CIAM, so consumer identities, customer identities, as well as business to business identities, all in that single bucket of external identities. But it's also based on a monthly active being the key word, monthly active users concept. So I may have 150,000 guest users in my environment, but only 35,000 of them sign in any given rolling 30-day period. I'm cool. I don't have to pay a dime for that. And I can, again, give them access to the full gamut of Entra ID P2 capabilities. Now, as Andy pointed out, we are just talking about the cloud identity platform. Remember how I said you could give a guest user access to Salesforce.com if you want? Sure, Salesforce is still going to want them to be licensed. You can give them access to other applications. Generally, those applications are still going to make you license them. They don't have a carve out for guest users. Now, Microsoft, in our case, again, in those core collaboration functions, so Exchange and SharePoint and Teams and OneDrive, absolutely allow guest users without any additional cost. You do not have to license them for those services. And that does compare differently against the other model we're talking about, where you do create identities in your environment, where, yeah, you pay for everything. You need a CAL for them to have an Active Directory domain services account. You need an Entra ID license. You may need a Defender for Identity license. You may need a Windows Enterprise license, so on and so forth, depending on what you're granting them access to. So that can be a more costly model, but keep in mind, with guest users, the only part that's technically really, quote unquote, included is the core identity functionality. So the risk-based CA, the entitlement management, access reviews, and PIM. That's what you get kind of baked in at no additional cost, which is a nice value for sure, but it may not cover your entire use case of what you're trying to accomplish. So just want to be super clear on that as well.
So now that we've kind of determined, I think in this case, where you have contractors that are doing work for you, right? So we're not just talking about the collaboration portion of it. We're not just talking about, a Teams channel or a Word document spreadsheet that we need to collaborate on. We're actually talking about maintaining infrastructure, SQL database administrators, so on and so forth. So now they're doing work for you. In that case, in my opinion, I think the best thing to do would be to grant them an identity within your organization.
I agree. But I do want to unpack that threat modeling for just 1 second, where it's Steve who wrote in and said, well, my security team says, well, we might not know their account is compromised, which is fair. And Steve says, yeah, but we might not know if they leave their organization. And Andy, you and I talked about this yesterday. And that is where we as security professionals do need to get good at threat modeling and probability. The probability of that account being compromised, I would easily say for any given account, is under 1%. The probability of that account being disabled and that person leaving that company on an infinite timescale is 100%. Everyone will leave a company at some point. So I think overall, and you can mitigate a lot of that risk with compromise. We didn't talk about this, Andy. You can turn on risk-based conditional access policies for guest users as well. Now, that risk is evaluated in their home tenant, but that's still fine. It is still going to look for anomalous behavior in those sign-ins and potentially block those sign-ins before they ever reach your tenant. So it's not like you have no controls and no ability to attempt to block anomalous or malicious sign-ins. You certainly have tools at your disposal as we talk through, but that's a much smaller risk than the very real risk that everyone will leave their company at some point and you still have an account sitting open for them. So I would tend to err with Steve on this one. I think he's right, where use guest users whenever they fit the use case. But as we are getting to, and you were just unpacking the point, Andy, in this scenario, when you've got contractors coming in doing legitimate IT work, database administrators, and working with Azure resources, I would, as much as I love guest identities, I would recommend you need to build them an identity in your.
Yeah. And I think the biggest concern here with Steve, and this is true at a lot of organizations that I've worked at, is that contractors don't come in the same way as regular full-time employees. Sometimes their onboarding methods are not the same. They don't go through employee onboarding. They don't go through benefits. They're literally signed a contract and they get an identity and they're off and going. And when the contract ends, they might not even go through the typical offboarding cycle, because they're not actually onboarded through their HR department with benefits and everything. They're just a contractor. They just get a check. And so I think that's a legitimate concern. And that's something that organizations have to get better at, is the life cycle management of contractor accounts.
Absolutely, yes.
And that's not something that I can give you a ton of insight on, but it's obviously something that a lot of organizations know. You just have to find a way to do reviews of those specific accounts, whether you organize them in a specific OU or you put them into a specific security group to review, and then look at the sign-ins. Like, we have tools in Entra to at least look at, last 30 days or however many days that account hasn't been signed in, and you can do access reviews of inactive users and so on and so forth. So you have to get better at that governance, at that lifecycle management of contractor accounts. So now that we've kind of established for this specific use case, okay, they're doing work for us, we should give them accounts in our organization. From a security perspective, we're going to treat them the same way as any other identity in our organization, right? So they're going to get assigned licenses the same way. In fact, if you have Defender for Endpoint or CrowdStrike or whatever, you're going to need to license them for that. You're going to need to license them for your identity provider, Entra, Okta, Ping, whatever. And then you're also going to need to provide them licenses for, Office 365, your collaboration platforms, all the things. I would treat them the same way and give them access to in the same way. But that being said, now let's talk about kind of how we can maybe segment out and reduce that risk of maybe they leave and they don't tell us, right? Because that is a risk. And so should we, Steve is asking here, should we provide, for RDP and SSH access to Azure and on-premise service and network devices? Because he said he's got network engineers, he's got people working on Azure, people on-prem, right? So these are server admins. How do we provide access to them? You can use RDP and SSH access through Azure Bastion. So this is the first question that Steve is asking. Should we provide them access through Bastion? Bastion is a great model. You do have to look at, because the other option besides Bastion is basically Jumpbox as a service within Azure. As long as the network route of your Azure environment can route to, and resolve DNS to your on-premise using like an express route VPN or site-to-site VPN or whatever, as long as that Azure VLAN has access to your on-prem, yeah, you can use Bastion to connect to those machines. And it's a very great way to do that, because you can store keys within Azure Vault. You're just using the browser. And so all of your Entra conditional access things can still apply at the time of authentication. And you have it right there with no additional infrastructure to stand up. There is a cost for Bastion. So you have to look at the cost of Bastion versus like the cost of providing them a physical laptop. And that physical laptop may be written off, because with contractors, you never know, right? They might just leave and then keep the laptop, and then you have to go through all these cycles to try to get it back. So you might need to evaluate the cost of a laptop. You might need to evaluate the cost of a virtual machine like Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365. And so those are things that you need to kind of look at. But the nice thing with Azure Bastion is that there's no infrastructure. Like, there's no additional box, right? So like with Windows 365 AVD, you still have a host that you need to maintain. Same thing with a physical laptop or desktop. You have to maintain that operating system. You got to patch it. You have to do all sorts of things to make sure that that particular device is secure. Whereas Bastion, you're just jumping into the on-premise server. So there's no additional infrastructure. You're just using Azure as an interface, and you have your on-premise server or whatever to maintain still, which you're always going to be doing. So I think Bastion is a good option, but again, there's a cost associated with that you need to evaluate. And so now we talk about like AVD. Steve asks, should we provide access via AVD, which then they RDP and SSH to the target server from? Some considerations. Is the RDP traffic to on-premise servers via Bastion encrypted or secure? If not, we'd have to layer a site-to-site VPN over our ExpressRoute, since ExpressRoute is not encrypted. So Steve's actually absolutely correct here. ExpressRoute is not encrypted by default. So if you do require encryption in transit of that tunnel, you do have to layer a site-to-site VPN or an IPsec tunnel or something on top of ExpressRoute. However, one thing to note is that it's still a private network, right? So you can think of an ExpressRoute to Azure as just an extension to another site physically. Like if I had my corporate network here in Wisconsin and Adam's at a remote site in Des Moines, and we have a tunnel stitching those two offices together, and it's private, it's not just exposed to the internet. That's the same thing as an ExpressRoute to Azure. It's just another site. So it's still...
Yeah, but zero trust, we shouldn't have any traffic flowing around unencrypted at this point, right? I get your point, but...
Yes, that is correct. But as long as you're not exposing things like within Azure to public IP addresses, and you have ports exposed to the internet. This is how one of my previous organizations ran, is that we had an AWS instance, and you couldn't get to the AWS instance unless you were on the corporate network. So you had to VPN onto the corporate network in order to, if you were remote. So it's just an extension of...
Right, but you get my point of like, we don't trust any traffic even on our corporate network. Moat and Castle is like not the model, so we just don't want any bits flowing around that are unencrypted. And I'm going to ask a dumb question here and show my ignorance right on the air. So SSH obviously is encrypted. Is RDP like totally still just unencrypted?
It's unencrypted
to this day?
Yeah, it's unencrypted. Okay. So, but the thing is that that's a good point, right, Adam? Is that, yes, we don't want any bits floating around. The question would be, do you encrypt all your traffic on-prem too?
Well, you should. You may not be. Yeah,
most people do not. In fact, that would be a terrible experience. I don't think no one in the world encrypts all their traffic on-prem.
Well, okay. What are we when we're talking about encrypted? I mean, like all like intercommunication between almost anything today is like all HTTPS anymore. Like everything's HTTPS. So like by default, anything flowing over, if I'm sitting on a corporate network and I'm sniffing traffic, most of it is encrypted protocols.
Right.
And there's a couple of them like Telnet, old school FTP port 21 that are all plain text. And I was just asking, is RDP like in that boat where it's still like you can just sniff it wide open?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the question, right? And this is the crux of Steve's question. And this is something that's very important for the listeners to understand, right? So if I'm sitting at home and I RDP to a machine that's sitting in my rack over here, that traffic is unencrypted because I'm not encrypting the actual network tunnel.
The protocol is not an encrypted protocol.
The protocol is not encrypted, which means anyone sitting on my network could sniff it out, right?
Yeah. Okay.
However, if I'm at a Starbucks and I SSH, or I'm sorry, if I VPN to my home network using an IPsec protocol, that VPN tunnel is encrypted. Okay. So no one who can
sitting in Starbucks,
right? That tunnel is encrypted. And then any traffic within that tunnel, if it's on port 22 or it's using HTTPS, is encrypted furthermore. Right? So
you have two layers.
You have two layers. But the tunnel itself is encrypted in my VPN if I'm using IPsec, right? But like if I'm sitting at home, my tunnels are not encrypted. And so that's what ExpressRoute is. It's just an extension of your home network, right, to another site, the site being Azure in this case, but who cares, right? It could be a site across the world via a tunnel that's unencrypted. As long as I'm assuming right now, I guess, there are other things to consider for zero trust, but you can't get to my server from externally. It's not exposed externally. The only way you can get to my server is on-prem. And so if I had another site like Azure that I could get into, And that had a tunnel back to that. Then I could connect to my server, right? So it's just like I'm sitting on my home network, but in Azure. What I'm saying is,
I get your point. I think what you're saying, if I'm understanding you right, is there's a certain point when like RDP is just an unencrypted protocol, period, end. And at a certain point, if an attacker is on close enough to you on the network, no matter how many different tunnels you create or anything else, at a certain point, they can view that
Correct.
unencrypted traffic too.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm with you now. Yes, I agree with that. And so you're kind of saying theoretically, yes, ExpressRoute is not encrypted, and you could layer a tunnel over on top of it, but what is that really getting?
Correct.
I think is where you're
correct.
Going. Okay, I'm with you now.
Yeah.
Yes, I follow.
Yeah, so exactly. So in my view, unless there are other risk factors, like you're exposing RDP to the external internet from your Azure machines, that's a huge.
Or back to your Starbucks example. If I'm sitting in Starbucks and I'm connecting to a public RDP host and I'm on the public Wi-Fi at Starbucks, someone can sit there and sniff my traffic all day.
On the public, on Starbucks network. Correct.
Right. Now, if I have to go through a VPN first, now they can't. Somebody else sitting on the public Wi-Fi can't sniff that traffic.
Correct.
It's encrypted till it gets onto my private network.
Correct.
And it's just, it's a risk inherent to RDP, which is like use less RDP, I guess.
So, and that's the question is that like, should you encrypt this traffic, right? And I think unless, for my opinion, unless you have a compliance framework that requires all traffic to be encrypted in transit, you don't need to do that. Of course, again, you want to mitigate anything that is available in your Azure tenant, like have Azure policy to prevent public IPs from getting assigned, a network security group, maybe like just-in-time access for those management ports, port 22, port 3389 with just-in-time access that's available for Azure machines. So, make sure that stuff is mitigated, because if you've locked down a lot of that access and then have conditional access policies to get into Azure, then you've mitigated a lot of that risk. Yeah, and a quick correction, Adam, your ignorance is probably my lack of knowledge here. RDP is actually encrypted. So, but the point still stands for using other unencrypted, like, services if you're using port 80 or Telnet or something like that. So,
I looked it up too. That's funny because I was like,
yeah,
we had to have added encryption at some point.
Yeah.
So like modern implementation, like Windows Vista and later does have TLS and AES encryption on it. So, that whole conversation I think is still, like you said, valid, especially for any lingering like plain text unencrypted protocols. But for the most part, I think your point still stands that I don't know if it's necessary to add another site-to-site VPN on top of ExpressRoute when it is already a private network to your organization, especially when modern RDP traffic, now that we know, and we should almost move this section in front of it so our listeners aren't screaming at us listening to this back. Now that we know that actually is encrypted, you don't need double encryption there. I don't think that's necessary.
Something like 99% of all of our traffic is encrypted end to end these days, and so most people have moved away from things that are. So the point still stands if you're listening on that.
And that's why, by the way, total side note, even the recommendation about it used to be like, don't use public Wi-Fi, and if you do, get on VPN immediately. Like, it's so insecure. It's like today there's so little you could sniff on public Wi-Fi because like every website's HTTPS anymore.
DNS would be the one thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's still benefits. I'm not saying there's not, but it's less of a need than it used to be. I mean, I have T-Mobile 5G, and it's so much faster than any Wi-Fi hotspot I ever find anyways. Like I use my mobile hotspot on my iPhone because it's faster and, obviously more secure.
Yeah. So Steve then asks more about AVD. AVD option combined with created accounts above would require Windows Enterprise and Defender for Endpoint licensings for those users. Yes, that is correct. We talked about that. So if you're creating users within your environment and then you give them AVD and then they are using the AVD box, which has Windows Enterprise and Defender for Endpoint on it, then yes, you would require those users to be licensed. And in fact, AVD can't be assigned to guest users. AVD does not support. And that goes to Adam's point, is that those applications that you're assigning, you can assign them anything, but those applications must be supported for those guest users. And in this case, this application AVD does not support B2B external users. So you have to use an internal user for that. When it comes to AVD options, should they be a separate host pool, really locked down like a PAW or SAW, a privileged access workstation? or secure access workstation device. You can put them on different host pools. That's absolutely, host pools can be a good way to separate, not only for organization, but also for different VLANs, different resources. You can segment them. And that's a perfect good way to do that if they have different access. And you can obviously put, like, let's say the host pools for the SQL database admins on one VLAN that only have access to those machines that they're going to support. You can have the host pools for another one only point to like the Linux machines that they're support, assuming that you have those machines, Linux machines, Windows servers, and your databases on separate VLANs to begin with. So that could create some more work on the network side to do that, because you have to segment that traffic out and have ACLs between those servers internally to block, traffic or whatnot from those other ones. So it gets a little bit complicated. And the question would be, what is your risk appetite in that, and along with the work to do that? And then should they be saws or paws, right? I would say, or I would ask, are you using saws and paws today? Do your admins already have saws and paws internally? Because if they don't, that's a lot of work to do that just for contractors who are going to leave, right? And so if you are already using saws and paws for administrative work, and that means like you have a dedicated paw specifically for on-premise admins, like domain admins, you have another paw that's Entra-joined specifically for global admin and Entra-joined devices. That's, again, most organizations are not at that maturity. So if you're using those today, yes, you can configure them like paws and saws to just access the certain resources that they need to administer. But if you're not doing that, then I don't think I would walk down that path.
Yeah, I agree with all those comments there. I mean, there's the right time and the wrong time to try to like up your security game, and doing more than you're doing in other places sometimes makes sense. Like, hey, this is an opportunity to prove out a new model, to try something different. And sometimes that's a great opportunity, and sometimes you should just maintain existing security posture to get something done, and then you can improve it over time across the board. This is maybe a little bit more organizationally dependent on kind of where you are and how you affect change in your environment. Again, like paws and saws are a good thing. We recommend them across the board. From a Microsoft guidance perspective, but it's all a matter of, is this the best place to start with that? I'm not sure that it is, because although you are certainly allowing these contractors to access sensitive systems and have a higher level of privilege, they may not be accessing or have the highest level of privilege and be accessing the most sensitive systems. I assume you still at least delegate that to your FTEs. So that would be a more logical place to start for me, would be with your global admins, and then maybe go down from there. And this might be a later option. But, in general, and we'll keep talking about AVD here, I love AVD, or really maybe even better is Windows 365 as the model for contractors and vendors moving forward. I've seen a lot of organizations look at this and adopt this because it just makes sense, where you don't have to deal with shipping hardware to and from, but they still get effectively a completely managed, trusted cloud PC that aligns to all of your requirements and protocols, but that lives inside of the Azure data center. And so you can be confident it's safe, and the hardware and supply chain are vetted, and all of those good things along the way. I think it's a really great way to do that level of access.
Okay, so we're wrapping up shortly here, but like a couple of other questions that Steve had. If we're using AVD, what mechanisms should we use to restrict users on that host to get to? Should we try and restrict network access per user, so DBAs can only get to SQL servers while Linux admins can only get to Ubuntu servers? Thinking Entra private access might be good here, but more licensing costs. So yeah, I mean, assuming that you already are controlling who can access those servers, locally, like permissions wise, who can SSH to them, who can RDP to them. And then you can, like we said, sit those AVDs on specific VLANs and then segment them out. But that would also mean that you'd have to segment out at the host level as well. You can use private access. Private access is a great way to do this, and you can run it through to on-premise machines, even from other machines, and have that segmentation, because it is a zero network trust access model, right? ZTNA zero trust network access. So you do have that, and it would be additional cost for that. But if you truly want that, I'm only going to connect to this resource when I need to, and that's it, then that's probably the path that you need to go down.
It's a noble goal, right? I mean, compared to the flat corporate networks of the past where everything talks to everything, like, yeah, the more segmentation you can do, generally that you have the manpower or person power to support is a good noble goal, but be aware of complexity and the value you're getting out of it and the ROI on that. Certainly network segmentation is a good thing. But I think you can go too far with that too. So again, if you can do it, great. I wouldn't lose sleep over this if you don't get quite that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just in general, kind of wrapping up my thoughts on this is you do need to have good governance and lifecycle management of those contractor accounts. That is the basic thing that you need to do first and foremost, because if you can't control the identity, then everything that follows after that is going to be a security risk or cost, right? You'll have these identities sitting on your network that are assigned licenses. And so you got to get a handle on that. And then when it comes to access, AVD and Windows 365 are great options. If you are going to use like a physical machine, if this was my company, I would just say, issue them a laptop and write it off. Issue them an Intune managed device and write it off, because that probably will never get sent back. I think it's extremely difficult for people to try to reconstitute their like hardware that they sent to contractors, because once their contract ends, like, what is their motivation to send back the hardware? I mean, you could threaten them with police action and all that other stuff, but that's a lot of like management overhead to try to get back what
more than it's worth,
like a $2,000 laptop. So that's my 2 cents, is having worked at the help desk and seen these go out the door and rarely ever come back. I mean, you can do other things like.
So why that model instead of a cloud PC where I can just assign it to the next contractor that comes in?
That's what I'm saying. Like, start with AVD and Windows 365. Those would be the models that I would go with.
Oh, okay.
But if you
were talking all this about a physical hardware,
but if you had to send them physical hardware, that's what I'm saying. Okay. If you decided to do that, I would just write it off.
Don't plan on getting
it back. So, because if they're technical enough, they'll just do a bare metal restore. Even if you have an autopilot policy on there, just do a bare metal restore and it's theirs. So, that's what I would do. Any final thoughts on that, Adam?
Yeah, again, I too would plug those models, and maybe can we do 60 seconds, Andy, on when you would choose AVD versus W3?
Yeah. So when it comes to,
because we've mentioned them both kind of in the same level, and they're two different solutions, and they both have better fit for different use cases.
Yeah, AVD really, when it comes to AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop, it's IaaS, right? Infrastructure as a service. So we give you the Legos, so to speak, to build a solution, but you might build a really crummy solution, right? Like, if I don't give you instructions to build, you're just going offhand and doing your own thing. If you're really good at that building, you can build a very eloquent solution. And in fact, multi-session is one of the best uses for AVD, because you might have contractors only doing like an hour of work in your environment. They might only have to go in for an hour or a couple times a day. And it might not make sense to sign them a physical laptop or a Windows 365 license. They're only going to be coming in for a little bit and they do work and then they're out. So multi-session, where you're sharing a massive machine and then being able to spin that down as well, because it's Azure costs. So maybe they're not doing work at night, so, and you have host pools that can share that resource as well, the load of each one. They can be assigned to different machines within that host pool. So there's a eloquent solution based on a need where you might not have that particular user require a machine all the time, and you can save some cost by spinning down different resources. Windows 365, if you don't want to have to deal with all of that, if you just want to say, Adam, here's a machine and go do work, Windows 365 is super easy. You click a button, you assign them a license, and you just pay for that SaaS cost. It's a SaaS service versus an IaaS. So you don't need to spin up any infrastructure. You don't need to do anything else. It just looks like a regular machine on your network as if you gave them a physical machine. You can manage it through Intune or hybrid AD join, hybrid enter join. And it's super simple, right? Like click a button, they get a machine, they sign in using their Enter ID, and you manage it just like a regular machine, and there's no other infrastructure to stand up. So if you don't want to have to deal with the hassle of AVD, you can just pay for the cost. Now, I think overall, if you're for a contractor, you probably will save a couple of bucks, going with AVD, but there is significant, personnel time that's involved in maintaining that infrastructure versus going to the admin portal of M365, clicking a license and just going.
I think too, as you talk through the use case for AVD, one of the things you mentioned is, let's say you have the type of contractor who comes in and does just a couple hours of work a week. AVD is clearly the solution for them. If you have the kind of contractor that effectively kind of looks like an FTE in terms of they work 40 hours a week for your organization, they're dedicated to your organization, they might be a better candidate for a cloud PC through Windows 365. For anyone where you would give them a laptop and say, here's your laptop, it's got Outlook on it, it's got the Office apps, it's got everything you need to do your work, you can just give them a cloud PC. It's effectively that. It's like laptop as a service in the cloud, where anything I can connect to RDP, I can go get to my cloud PC. Also, one other note as well, you did a good job kind of comparing, you got to build it yourself versus it's already built. AVD, it's a consumption-based model. So however you build it, however many resources are getting consumed per hour, per day, you pay for that. Windows 365, predictable cost. It's a license. It's this much per user per month, the end, or per cloud PC per month. And so you know exactly how much you're signed up for, how much you're going to pay. There are no overages or anything else. I mean, there are some edge cases where you can have some overages, but that's pretty rare. So yeah, I mean, two great models. And again, it kind of depends what kind of contractor or vendor you have. But I would really, at the end of the day, point folks towards those solutions. And I would avoid as much as possible giving them hardware anymore. Because if you look at it, you can get a cloud PC for under the cost you're going to spend on hardware. And the beauty of it, if that person leaves or that contract is up, you can just assign it to another person. Just take the license off, give it to a new person, away they go. You got another cloud PC and now they can do their thing. So it's really quick and easy to reassign. And this is, to be honest, where we're seeing a ton of success is exactly this model, exactly these use cases. These are the number one way people are using these today. And Andy, you have lived in AVD to do your Microsoft work over the years, or was it a W3 cloud PC? I forget what you had.
Yeah, so every FTE at Microsoft gets AVD and for free. And in fact, I use that on a daily basis, and I still do. It's a great experience. There are some limitations to it from the Microsoft side, but I think that's just for policies, like what we can do to the AVD. But from a Microsoft perspective, I actually, for the most part, live in AVD every day. I sometimes will use my physical machines every now and then. I'll boot them up. Windows 365, you have to have a use case for it. However, if you want nowadays, like if you're up for refresh on your physical device, you can say, I don't want a new device. I just want a Windows 365 machine. And so we do require phish resistant MFA and all of that. So you do have to have passkeys or FIDO2 in order to get to these machines, but they're a great experience. We've optimized it for Teams and everything. And I haven't had any issues with using these jump boxes. So I think it's great.
Yeah, that's a good plug. And then just one last note here. One final kind of question from Steve in his email before we wrap. He had finally mentioned they were disabling public interfaces on their Azure resources so they can no longer run the SQL Server Management Studio on their client and remote connect. Good move, Steve. Very happy to hear that. Turn off all those public interfaces, please. But he asked the question of, should we do AVD? Or should we just open that public interface, but whitelist like the MSP, the managed service providers, IP addresses instead? Don't do that. Please don't. Going back to Andy and I we talked a couple zero trust things earlier. You can't trust that network either. We just don't trust anyone's network implicitly. And so I would much rather they came in through AVD, had to meet all of your security requirements. They're on a trusted private network. Where you're doing that real-time and constant evaluation of the security of the solution, instead of just trusting an IP range.
Yeah.
That to me is a much stronger model. So I know there's more cost involved with it, but this is one of those, Andy, and I think you made the point on this too. Overall, it's an area of opportunity for most organizations to really build rigor around how we manage contractor and vendor accounts and the life cycle of them moving forward. And it's a tough nut to crack because it requires partnership with HR, with other parts of the business, with getting the buy-in to run things a certain way. It's not easy to solve for. And as Steve's note pointed out, there's a ton of considerations along the way. But I think for the most part, by the end of this conversation, as we talk through it, we both kind of settled in the same place of 99% of the time, you're better off giving them AVD or Windows 365. And I think that's the best solution. And there's more to solve for than just that, but that's a great starting point to start to build out your solution.
And one final thing, from a user perspective, it can also be a better experience. I will use Microsoft as a good example. Microsoft started implementing network layer controls on top of all the other things for some of our data, right? So
internal apps. Yeah.
For example, Adam and I are in sales, so some of our internal customer information, now we need to go to Azure VPN. We have to VPN in order to get to that data. I've talked to some sales folks and they're like, well, Azure VPN sucks. Like I can't connect to it. It drops all the time. It's super slow. And yes, that can be a terrible experience because that VPN tunnel has to be maintained. You only have certain pipeline, so on and so forth. Guess what? On an AVD box, it's connected on the back end. So I can get to those sales tools without having to VPN in. And in fact, I've talked to some of my, SSPs and I've said, hey, guess what? You can get an AVD box at no additional cost. Like as a full-time employee, you can get that. So instead of using Azure VPN to connect your physical host to the VPN network, just launch AVD and you get everything in there. So, and you can do that from even a Microsoft joined machine. And I'm seeing that Adam is having the wheels turn in his head because
yes,
I bet you've had
hamster is spinning on the
some
wheel.
terrible experiences within some of our tools of loading and all this other stuff. But guess what? It runs super fast in an AVD box. So from a user perspective, because it's on that back plane of Azure, right? Like
sits on the same network.
Yeah, it's super fast. So anyways, from a user perspective, it can be even a better experience than having to issue out, the old school way of getting a physical laptop and VPN and all of that. So, all right. That was a great show. Hopefully you learned something. If you have any questions, our contact information will be in the show notes. Email us if you have ideas for a show like this one. Thank you so much for listening and watching as always. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.